Are we live?
Yes, Sophie, we're live now.
Thanks so much. Happy Africa Day, everyone. Thanks so much for investing your time with us, given so many things that are happening today. My name is Sophie Masipa, and I'll be your moderator for today. My job is quite simple, I believe, because I'm joined by an amazing panel for a session on leading from the front, strategic comms in the wake of COVID-19. I'd like to add to that and beyond. We'll be taking you today through the role of communications, communicators, and really the impact of COVID on how we think about the discipline today. Our goal is that whatever your role is in the industry, you will come away with something, whether it's a new idea, a fresh perspective, or a new strategy that you can apply in your own role. For now, just to take you through how we're going to run today's session is I'm going to ask each of our panelists just to give us a short view, their own view and thoughts around today's topic. We'll then delve deeply through a Q&A format on the high level themes for today, and we'll then take some Q&A. But I would like to suggest that we make the session as interactive as possible. So do come on our chat, share your thoughts, share your views, and ask questions as we move along. Today, I'm joined by Moky Makura. Oh, you know, I met Moky. I always say to people, I met Moky. I didn't meet her personally because in the age of digital, of course, we can talk about e-meet. I met the name Moky Makura many moons ago when she was still on carte blanche. And really, when she wrote her book on African entrepreneurs, I totally loved it. So I've been in awe of her career and in awe of this wonderful, beautiful woman who's since become a friend and a sister. Moky is the executive director of Africa No Filter, and she will tell you more later as we move through the session about her role and her time in communications. She has extensive and a wealth of knowledge and expertise in this field. I'm also joined by Dr. Victor Oladokun. Oh, Victor, what a joy to speak to. Victor has been in the space for over 25 years, spanning across broadcasting, our communications. I mean, what a joy it is and what an honor it is to have you on board today, because clearly we can have a conversation about how communications has evolved throughout the years through your time in this space. Victor was recently the former head of communications at the African Development Bank. He, of course, brings along another more wealth of experience. We are also now, he's here. We're joined by Ogra. He's the group head of communications at the BUA Group. It's funny, I was on another session this morning on Brand Africa 100 Brands. If you don't know BUA Group, it's actually one of the African largest conglomerates based out of Nigeria. And I'm sure we're gonna see that the company on the Brand Africa 100 list sometime soon. So thanks so much. Such a pleasure to have you.
Thank you.
I think I'm gonna kick off with you, Dr. Victor, because I think having had such a varied experience, such a varied time in this discipline, if you can just give us your thoughts on today's topic around leading from the front, strategic communications in the era of COVID. What are your thoughts on that? Just a short synopsis, because I don't want us to take up too much of our time. Yeah, please.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much, Sophie, and congratulations to you, Annie, and the rest of the team that has put this wonderful event together today and during the rest of the week. And let me also say happy Africa Day to you all. What I just want to say here is this, that moving ahead during this season that we're in, what institutions, governments, corporates, and the many principles that we represent, what they do with communication today will determine their success or otherwise. Today, organizations are going to be challenged to communicate not less, but actually a whole lot more. You know, prior to this session, I just wanted to quickly check one of my favorite brands, Coca-Cola, and in its 180 years, I noticed that it has actually spent a whole lot more on communication and communication-related activities rather than less. In 2019 alone, it spent $4.24 billion on communication-related activities. And its budget really is a reflection of its global intentions. And I think that is also true of any institution. Show me where the money is, show me where the budget is, and I can tell you whether the institutions are really serious about communication or not. But today we are challenged. This is the greatest challenge of our generation. And therefore the pressures on us to communicate much more strategically are going to be a whole lot more than ever before. But allow me to share this very, very quick analogy with us. During World War II, the Allies were challenged due to the fog and the clouds over Europe, and found it very, very difficult to hit targets in Nazi-occupied Europe. Well, at the time, they created this bombardment group. It was the 482nd Bombardment Group. And they came up with a new technology, which we now know as radars. What the radar allowed them to do was see through the fog, see through the clouds, and they were then able to pinpoint targets very, very accurately, instead of what they did in the past, which was just blind bombing. These navigators and aviators were called pathfinders. And I want to connect that today with the conversation that we're having. Our role as professional communicators is as pathfinders, helping to craft messaging, helping to use communication strategically, and enabling our principals, our organizations, institutions, or nations to see through the fog of chaos, complexity, and crisis in order to target audiences very, very specifically with appropriate messages. That's really where we find ourselves today, and that's really the challenge that is ahead of us. We need to be very precise and not depend on blind bombing, which is just hoping that your message will somehow hit the target. We've got to be a whole lot more strategic in our thinking and also in our practice. So really that's where I'd like to pivot off at this point during this conversation.
Well, thanks, Victor. Here's to the Pathfinders, because there are a whole lot of them who've joined us today on this Africa Communications Week platform. Well, I think I'd like to take from where Victor left off in terms of Coca-Cola and the size and reflecting on how much corporates are also seeing the importance of communications, and bring you in, Ote. You are the group head of corporate communications for BUA Group. BUA has also been growing in reputation over the last couple of years. So I'd like to hear your thoughts from an organization and business point of view with regards to today's topic.
So thank you, Sophie. It's great to be here today, and I think this topic is very, very important now more than ever as we get out of this major issue that is affecting the entire world. For communicators at this point in time, more than anything, will be the need for brands to start to show a lot more humanness in relating with their target audiences or end users. So currently, you're seeing a lot of brands doing a whole lot of things. Coca-Cola, which Victor just spoke about, has done little to no communications during this period. Where they've done communications, it's actually been to tell very, very human narratives that can actually touch and people can actually relate with at every point in time. So we're going to see that shift. Secondly, for organizations, we will also see a point where organizations are no longer taking the communications function as a cost-centered function. We will see a shift towards more of a management function for corporate communicators and strategic communicators in organizations. And that is very, very important, because if we cannot adapt our practice at this point in time to the realities on ground, then there will be a major, major, major issue for a lot of communicators out there. So brands need to see us step up. Brands need to see us, take much more control over our job, take more control over understanding the business in itself and pushing that narrative out in the most humane way possible.
I like what you're saying about this human touch. This is what I call brand intimacy. You know, if I put on my branding hat, that's kind of how I like to capture that brand intimacy. My sister Moky, I think I love, if I want to connect this notion of human intimacy or humanness, and the thing that you do so well around storytelling. You've been in the space of storytelling for so many years and how you capture it. I wanted to bring you in now and get your thoughts around today's topic and what your views are.
Okay, so hi everybody. So let me start with a story. So prior to this role as African Unfiltered, I used to be at the Gates Foundation. And I remember once we were in front of the health minister, actually of South Africa, who actually said to us that he wanted to use communications much more strategically in the fight against HIV and TB. And it suddenly struck me then that, a lot of public health people put money into programs, into drugs for HIV, for TB. But the single most powerful tool to actually prevent HIV and TB was actually communications. And there's very little support, very little funding that went into the communications aspect of that. And that's just to say that, COVID, as awful as it is, and, the global crisis it's caused, it started off as a health pandemic, now it's an economic crisis. It's actually shown me in so many ways that communications is critical now. There's a lot of organizations who are probably regretting that they did not put the right kind of communications people in place, because if there are three things that I think companies need to focus on now, one is people. Who is your team? Who are your people who you are tasking to speak to communicate messages? The second thing is the information you're putting out there. There's information versus communication. If you're just putting stuff out there, who's getting it? And for me, the third thing is actually the content you're putting out. I mean, I think we've talked a lot about the, Coca-Cola and their brand, and the fact that, their storytelling is about people, the content you're putting out there, how compelling is it and how purpose-driven is it? And I actually really think that in this time that, organizations, brands need to think a lot more about who they're communicating with, insights, because in order for you to, drive an effective communication campaign, you have to have insights. And just a quick example of where this insight was totally lacking in this COVID response. Everybody was putting out communication, wash your hands, use hand sanitizer, not realizing that the bulk of the population they were talking to had no access to water, suddenly had no way of buying sanitizer. So that was useless information. Communications is strategic based on insight. And I think companies have to spend a lot more building that insight, not just for them to go sell their brand. That's not necessarily what it's all about, but to actually just build a brand that's got purpose. So let me leave it at that. Over to you, Sophie.
Thanks. Moky, I like this notion that you bring up of insights, because it's insights, the right insights allows you to craft the right proposition. If you speak from a branding point of view, use your insight to craft your creative comms, you craft your brand proposition. Victor, perhaps a good time to bring you in here about messaging, because not only was the messaging wrong around, well, not wrong, but missing some beats around people washing their hands, even in the absence of the proper tools for that to happen, is when I look at the timeline between the first case of COVID, or rather the first case of COVID, and when who actually declared this a pandemic and allowing people to catch up, the message seems to have taken long to come to the fold. How important is the notion of getting the right messaging, the right timing for that? How important do you think that is?
Well, once again, Sophie, that's a really great question. And I think if we take a look at what has happened globally, we'll see that even some of the world's leading countries, some of the major powers, really have dropped the ball when it comes to communication and messaging. In particular, two countries come to mind. There are many others, but definitely Brazil is one of them. The United States is another one, where we've actually seen conflicting messages, mixed messages, a whole lot of confusion, as well as the denial of the problem to begin with. So more to your question, communication and proper messaging is critically important. Some countries and some organizations have done extremely well, while many others have not. And with the advantage of hindsight, many of us and many institutions and organizations can look back and see where mistakes have been made in terms of policy U-turns, in terms of the conflicting messages. But this has been a learning curve for a whole lot of people. As I said earlier, this is the greatest crisis of our generation, of our time. And good leadership just emerges in times of crisis. For us in this space, in this industry, the whole business has changed. Not only is the way that consumers are now engaging communication changing, business models are changing. Essentially, anybody who's in business today is a startup. Whatever worked in the past doesn't work today. New business models are required, new ways of doing things are absolutely necessary, and therefore the way we communicate is also essential. But one of the things that I want to talk about, and I'm sure you'll probably bring this up later on, is really the result of the lack of communication or coherent messaging, which has led to a whole lot of things, everything from fear, anxiety, depression, confusion, detachment, loneliness, not to talk of the conspiracy theories that surround this whole issue. And some institutions, some countries have actually ceded that space rather than controlling the narrative. So in the process, we've lost ground. There have been reputational issues at stake, both individual and organizational. And our role here is to help shape things, help provide a framework for people to understand what is happening, why it's happening, and what they can do about it.
So Moky, that's a great point to come in at, because every time you hear messaging, there's always another word tied to that, and that word narrative. You know, I've been reading up a lot on, besides attending a whole lot of webinars, I've been reading up a lot on this whole US-China effect. And what I've found really interesting lately is that this whole wolf warrior ethos that China has adopted for a country that seemingly didn't really drive its reputation. You're seeing a lot more globally that the diplomats have come to the fold on social media, in newsprint, really defending this narrative that's taken a hold of China. Can we chat a bit more about this narrative? And for Africa, is there a narrative? Should there be a narrative? What is this all about?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great point to make, because I think, the World Health Assembly recently, that's when, China apparently hijacked the whole thing, committed, I think, $2 billion towards the fight against COVID, really trying to take back, the messaging, take back its position. I think the one thing is that China has always very carefully crafted its own messaging, but it's done it in a very sort of quiet way. It's soft power, a lot of things it's done behind the scenes. I mean, it built the AU building in Ethiopia for Africa. So it's been here doing its own business. And I think right now, because the global discussion is pointing a finger at China for starting this and just not being transparent, and particularly when the stories came out about the Africans who were being treated really badly in China, because somehow we went from China possibly starting COVID to Africans bringing it there. I mean, that's, ridiculous. Yeah. But I mean, the point is that I think narrative is important. And just to explain how I think about narrative is a series of stories, right? You have multiple stories. So there's China, possibly starting COVID. There's China, treating Africans badly. There's China not giving enough money to the WHO. All of those stories lead up to a particular narrative about China, that China kind of goes it alone. It's actually, one of these countries, you can't really trust it. The narrative is one of, we don't trust China. And right now, it's beginning to take build up momentum. So I feel that they are going more public in the way they're fighting it. So they're going on to traditional, social media platforms to do it. I mean, Twitter and Facebook are not even in China. So they've had their own, platform, WeChat, which they've controlled messaging going into China. So I think they're just being a lot more public now. But, when it comes to the point of, is narrative important? Absolutely. In fact, the organization that I'm heading up, I just left my job at the Gates Foundation to do this, at work at Africa No Filter. It's all about trying to shift the African narrative away from that single narrative about us being this hopeless continent that's just dependent and is always the beneficiary. It's never the instigator, to one that's much more progressive, one that's more reminiscent of the continent that I grew up in as an African. So that's what the organization is about. And it's really not about good news. There's a lot of negative stuff that comes out about the continent, but what we are saying is that we are not just that. We are more than that single story. And it's up to us to put up those other stories so that they are just multiple narratives, that you don't think Africa and you think, oh, poverty. Yeah, those poor Africans, that's not the Africa that I know. And we just need to be more deliberate about putting out messaging like China is doing right now, because its reputation is being tarnished and it cares. We need to care more.
Moky, and Sophie, if I can just jump in here. I think, Moky, you've raised a very, very valid point here. Prior to now, because of its culture, China has been very reticent about pushing itself and shaping its own narrative. It's done it in a very, very subtle way, but that has changed within the last few months. And you can see that it's no longer about soft diplomacy. Actually, a lot of the ambassadors who have been sent to Europe and the United States and a number of other key capitals of the world have come out a whole lot more aggressive. And I think what you're seeing is a reflection and a mirroring of the kind of diplomacy, or the lack of it, that's coming out of the United States, and China is responding in turn. I'm actually excited about what you're doing and what your institution is doing, because the truth is, for way too long, we've outsourced the shaping of our own narrative as Africans. We tend to look to the West to define who it is that we are. Most times other people tell us who we are. I'm extremely bullish about Africa. I'm excited about the future, the opportunities that lie ahead of us. And I still believe that Africa's best days are ahead of us. It's time for us to take hold of our own destiny, take hold of our own narrative, and shape the future that we want.
I mean,
Victor, you need to come and help me on Africa No Filter. That's exactly what we're doing.
Join forces. Okay, then coming on for this notion of messaging and narratives. Obviously, one of the things that happens when you don't have a bit of control on that is the infiltration of fake news. I would imagine for a business like yours, or business in general, it's one of the key challenges. A lot of the governments are starting to slowly get it right during this phase. But how are you guys? How have you been dealing with that on your end? And how important has it been to have a central point of communication?
So communications for us as a brand has basically been about understanding where we need our messaging to get to, and also trying as much as possible to pinpoint who the best carriers and platforms for these messages are. Over time, you tend to build some form of trust in those platforms. People tend to look at those platforms as an extension of your own main communications platform over time. And it's easier for you to help shape misinformation and disinformation whenever it comes out on third-party platforms. So for instance, if a negative news were to come out about Boa today, our primary audiences are more likely to look at the platforms they're coming on and able to make a deduction or deduce whether it's really from what. On the flip side, because of the platforms, we have a whole lot of platforms that are available to us today. Social media and instant messaging platforms have given people the opportunities to just say things, to be able to tweak narratives, to be able to tweak real news and disinform. When those kind of things happen, chances are they will always happen. You cannot really do anything about misinformation and information. The important thing, how well do you monitor? How often are you in front of news that, I mean, concerning your organization, your government, or your corporation? How quickly do you respond to those crises or false information when they come on stream? That will make the difference. That will be the difference between if the misinformation goes viral or if you're able to nip it in the bud. It's a very thin line. It has to do with a lot of monitoring. It has to do with a lot of quick response. It has to also do with a lot of putting frameworks in place to help when these things happen. How well do you react to them? Thank you.
Great. Thanks. We have a question here. In light of COVID pandemic, and the effect it's having on global economies, in what ways will communication play a role in dynamic leadership moving forward? And this is from Derek Oladokun. Is that your relative, Victor?
That is certainly my younger brother. Yes, he's sending that in from Atlanta, I believe.
Glad to know that the family is supporting you today.
Maybe you should answer your brother. Maybe start answering your brother then.
Okay, well, he caught me by surprise there, but what I'll say is that the COVID pandemic is really the greatest leadership challenge of our generation, and ultimately, leadership will determine the success or otherwise of institutions, of corporates, of nations. And as I said earlier, some organizations have done exceptionally well. They've had incredible visionary leaders, while others have not. A number of years ago, I defined leadership simply as the capacity to see the future long before it arrives and bring it successfully into the present. To do so, the power of communication is what you need to make a transformational impact. But let me just give you one example, a very simple analogy here. 21 years ago, I was visiting Dubai, and what you see today downtown with all of the major boulevards, whether it's Sheikh Zayed Boulevard, back then was just sand in the desert. They were actually marking the ground. But as I began to speak to the officials in Dubai, they were—
We've lost you, Victor.
About where they were crystal clear about where they were going and how they were going to get there. They were totally crystal clear about it. And 21 years later, here we are. So for me, it's not turbulence, it's not crisis that is the problem, but many times our propensity to use yesterday's logic to try and solve today's problems. But aside from that, the inability to anticipate the future that is before us. So certainly what we need today in Africa are visionary leaders that are able to communicate very clearly a preferable future for us, whether that's our organizations, whether that's our nations. Communication is an integral part of leadership. Show me a leader that cannot communicate, and I'll show you who is not a leader. So to my mind, what we really need from our leaders are ACEs. I used the analogy of pilots earlier, but ACEs as in ACES. And for me, that analogy simply means that we need leaders who can communicate appropriate, creative, engaging, and strategic messages at the right time. But again, that's going to depend on what it is that the leaders are seeing in the future ahead of them.
So, okay, I know this is also a passion point for you. I was about to say you can jump in because
I wanted to jump in and respond to something Victor said. Actually, something you said earlier on. You actually said good leadership emerges in times of crisis. And I actually want to say that, communication is a two-edged sword. It can destroy you as much as it can build you. Because I think that just the fact that you have a platform to communicate and you are able to communicate doesn't mean that you need to communicate. Communication is a strategic tool. It needs to be used judiciously as and when. And I think an ideal example of that is seeing how Donald Trump is communicating random thoughts. as he's going along, just in front of a world audience, sending out conflicting messaging. People are Googling, should I be drinking bleach? It's unstructured. I mean, that would be a PR person's nightmare, having to be his press secretary. So I'm just saying that, I don't think the communications that that Donald Trump has done him any favors at all. So that's what I'm saying, you've got to be careful about how you use this tool called communication. And someone like Cyril Ramaphosa, I feel that he's used it in a very strategic, clever way. He hasn't over-communicated. He spoke again yesterday. We're told before he comes on, he has a very scripted, measured delivery, well thought through. You kind of walk away thinking, okay, fine, I know what's going on. The next stage is the ministers now come on board and now unpack some of the stuff he said. People are still, picking holes at how he's come up with these, level 3, level 4. But the point is that I feel that he's using communications well. It's a double-sided sword. You've got to be careful. It can kill you or it can make you.
Or it can make you. Absolutely. And I mean, if we have to think about, you can't speak about leadership without speaking about the number one audience to it, or your number one stakeholder to that, being either, if you're a leader, your citizen, if you're a company owner, the people who work for you. So Ote, one of my observations over time is that we spend a lot of time as communicators so focused on the external. It takes a long time for people to start to do effective internal communications that can really, really speak to the external. How has it been on your end as a company, and what are your views on this? Actually, not actually your views, but what has been the balance of communication between your external and internal processes?
So thank you very much for that question. That's a great one. For us, internal communications is very, very key. I'm of the school of thought that for every organization or government or group, as the case may be, you need to always speak first to your internal audience. They form your first line of defense in times of crisis. And when you're even trying to push out positive news, once they're well informed, it's easier for your messaging to be received by other people. So internal first, external, and then at the same time, it's for us, one thing we've done throughout this crisis has been at every point in time to communicate with our staff and our employees across the country, whether it's via phone calls or email messages or our apps, our internal messaging apps that we use within the organization. What that has done for us is assuage the fears of our employees across the country. Now they know they're not going to be sacked for working remotely. They're not going to be penalized for not being at their system sometimes because, they're having to work remotely. And for those that are having to go to work during this crisis, we have put in place a whole lot of frameworks to protect them from the virus itself and from contracting the virus. What that has also done for us is whenever we move to the external fronts to push our messages out there, our people are always behind us. Our people are behind us sharing those messages. They're behind us helping to provide more clarity for places where we cannot reach at that point in time to third parties. And if the case is something that they cannot really answer, they push it back to the organization. It's also important that governments do the same thing. I'll use a very local example here. The Lagos State government, throughout this crisis, one thing they've done very well has been to use the ministers in charge, just like the South African president has done with his ministers, to push, or the commissioners in charge, to push key messaging to the general public. What has that done for Lagos? There is more trust coming out of the Lagos State government for the messages that have been coming out from the Lagos State government than there is from the national government. That's not to say the national government is not doing anything, or that's not to say they're not doing anything right, but they were slow to get to the starting point. And that took away some of the trust that they would have gotten from the general public at a critical time such as this. Now, people know to expect the president at certain times. It might not be all glamorous as the president of New Zealand or whatsoever, but it might not be as funny as Donald Trump's, but we know the president is going to come out at various times to give certain messages that put people's minds at ease. We need to see them do more. Take, like I said earlier, the Lagos State example and try to replicate that at the national level to ensure that the entire nation actually comes behind them. That's the power of internal communications. You ignore internal communications at your own peril. Thank you.
Such an important theme, I think, that you've all raised today, which is this notion of trust, communication creating trust. I want to take another question, and this one is from Lungi Morrison. And she asks, Africa is comprised of majority youth compared with the rest of the world. How do we leverage the voice of our youth as communicators? I'll start with you, Moky, and then I didn't want to give it to Ote. Everyone will say, oh, I'm being.
I mean, I think it's a good question because it's a difficult question. How do we leverage our youth in communication?
Yeah.
My question back to Lungi would be, what is it we want to communicate? What is it we want to communicate? I think we almost have to figure that out first as a continent, as a country, and then we bring in the people who are going to carry that message forward. And actually, to be honest, yes, what is the percentage? 60, 80% of our, African population is young. So we absolutely need to have them on board. But to be honest, youth are in those positions now. People who are under 30 are running communications departments. They're doing this stuff. So I almost, when I hear questions like this, I always think that what is stopping the youth from taking that power? It's always as if somebody's holding you back, as in don't do it. There's nobody holding you back. So I would ask the question back to Lungi, really. Unfortunately, you don't have the opportunity to respond. Is what is the message we want to communicate?
I'm sorry, may I add something before Lungi responds? It is very important for us to realize that there seems to be a disconnect, and it's something I see very often, even in the corporate world, between those in corporate communications positions and the key leadership in whatever structure you may have. And for as long as that disconnect is there, because one, these people are, the corporate communicators are either not sensitive enough on those tables where they are, or they do not understand the business as a whole, it will be very difficult to see people stand up, I mean communicators now, within the structures, until they decide once and for all to move away from PR as it is in the African sense of things, which is, oh, we're just reporters. That is journalism. We're talking about communications here. You need to understand the business itself. You need to understand how communications can affect every single part, from strategy to accounting or finance to risk management. You need to understand how communications is critical towards helping those functions achieve their goals. And then the organization of the government as a whole. How can communicators step up and be more important? These days, you hear a lot of key executives tell communicators that this is what we want to send out. And they just go and do it. So it's more of the reports, they give you something and you report. No, that should not be the way. Communicators should always lead from the front. That way you can understand everything and present a more balanced and nuanced opinion. So key executives, as the case may be, and I'm sure we'll see more people who are willing to do that and went into the post-COVID period.
And Moky, that's to that point you raised earlier on in your opening around the type of communicator. What does this individual look like? Victor, I've got a question because you were at the bank for a while, but it's not necessarily a bank question. And it's a question for any of us, really. When we think about communications across the continent and the tools to communicate, there is no really, there's no African platform that can carry the messages. A lot of us rely on a viewpoint from an international source, whether it's the BBC or the CNNs of the world. How can we improve that state? I don't see even the African Development Bank financing a lot of initiatives around platforms for communication.
Okay, well, thanks, Sophie. I'm glad to see that Moky's taken the lead in this regard, and I think all of us have had one-on-one conversations in times past where we've actually talked about this. one of my greatest frustrations as a communicator who's been in the business for almost 3 decades is, as I said earlier, the outsourcing of our narrative. And there are many reasons for this. About 30 years ago, the technologies for being able to tell your own story were prohibitively expensive. I remember when I started out in television broadcasting, a CMX editing machine at the time for editing cost close to $600,000. Well, a laptop today that costs $2,000 with a whole lot of software, or for that matter, even a sophisticated mobile phone, is 1,000 times much more powerful than the most powerful and the most expensive tools 30 years ago. So what does that say to us? It says that the monopoly that those with the resources had in order to shape the narrative many years ago is actually gone. We have the ability, we have the technology, it's inexpensive, and we can tell our stories, and we are beginning to tell our own stories. But I think more to your point, what we need to see in order to break the monopoly of our narrative being shaped by others other than ourselves, what I believe that we need to do, and I'll connect this again to the question earlier about the youth. They shouldn't feel disempowered. Nobody in the business today should feel disempowered. What we really need today are not businesses that are about me, myself, and I. You can't be the CEO, the CFO, the COO, the producer, or what have you, all in one. What I'd love for us to see moving forward are alliances, mergers, partnerships that bring together the best of money, technology, and talent. And that's really how, in the West, some of these major behemoths, these media conglomerates have developed. It's bringing the best of money, bringing the best of talent, and bringing the best of technology together. We can do it. We're in a totally new terrain today. I would like to see a whole lot more like-minded organizations, rather than reinventing the wheel, coming together to create these media and communication giants that we need to shape the narrative on the continent.
Thanks, Victor. Moky, you touched on the communications of South Africa earlier on. So perhaps if you can pick up on this question as well, is how would you assess the communication efforts of African countries in the face of the present pandemic? And then are they, I guess you've already mentioned South Africa, but are there African countries that have done well with communicating appropriately at this question, at this period? And the question is from Toluwalase.
Thanks for that. I think it's a good question, and I don't know that I actually have been following all the communications around the different countries and what they're doing. I mean, I sit in South Africa, so the communication has been, directly impact on me. So I'm listening out for that. I have a lot of friends in Nigeria, and in Kenya, and I know that, and I think, Otega, you said it, that the president of Nigeria has been a little bit not that, around. He hasn't been that, accessible. But I actually think that a lot of time we're judging this communication from what's coming out from leadership at the very top. And I don't think that's a good judge of how a country is responding to COVID-19 in terms of communication. I think it's levels below that, subnational and district level, because a lot of the issues we're finding and where people are thinking that, there is no communication is because they are not being communicated to. They're in an area where they haven't had water deliveries, where they have, they're looking to see how is government going to address them with schools, taking their kids back to schools, getting, water, all of these smaller issues. So this big sort of, the overarching message, often, yeah, you can tick the box. I think Ramaphosa has done a great job at that, but I think further down the line, no. So again, it's hard to kind of just pinpoint a specific country you're doing well, because I think it's from the top to the bottom. And I think very, very, very few countries have probably got it right.
And if I could also jump in there again, Moky, I think what we're going to see coming out of the COVID pandemic, whenever that happens, whether that's in a few months or probably in another year or more, is that the demands on leaders are actually going to increase. The electorate audiences are going to be less tolerant of incompetence, the poor delivery of services, they're going to be asking a whole lot of questions. Why has our educational system not worked? Why hasn't it prepared for this new digital world that we're in? Why are our health systems in the mess that they're in? Why is the economy in shambles? There are a whole lot of questions that are going to be asked. So leaders need to begin to prepare even now for the inevitable that will occur either in the next few months or post this, this pandemic. The demand for accurate strategic communication on our leadership is going to be a whole lot more than anything they've ever experienced before. So communication cannot be peripheral. It cannot be the way we've done it in the past, where at the end of the day, management gets together, huddles, and then they come over to the communication team and say, hey, help us push this up. No, communication has to be integral. It has to be pivotal. It has to be right in the middle of all decision making, policy, and thinking moving forward.
You're on mute, Sophie, I think.
In that case, we'll tag along till she comes along, Moky.
she's unmuted. I can, yeah. Well, maybe we should just. Sophia, you're on. I can see you're unmuted now. No. Oh, she's not. Okay. I don't know if she can hear us, but maybe something else we can actually riff on now that we're in control. There's a question I saw about somebody saying about media platforms that, Victor, you touched on it, and it's something that I know that a number of media entrepreneurs have tried to put out a Pan-African, news channel, saying that, thinking that people are going to come. I think the bottom line why a lot of these initiatives have failed is that people fundamentally want to know what's going on around them. We tune into CNN and BBC, but that's not my daily dose. I read the local newspapers to figure out what's affecting me. So, will I, give that up and tune into an African thing? How often will you find me there? Is it enough for advertisers to go and get me there rather than to find me, on my, my daily dose, which is my local outlet? And also I'm getting a lot of stuff free on social media. So I think that thing of wanting that Pan-African media outlet, I feel it's a little bit dated now. I don't know that people want it. So, again, I just wanted to say that we get that a lot. And I think
actually, I have a totally different opinion. If you look at China, a number of years ago, they came up with CCTV, which was on a lot of the cable systems across Africa. And at the time, it was horrible broadcasting, if I can call it that. And I used to say to myself, who in the world is watching all of this? But they've upped their game. And right now they have quite a lot of really good programming that's on there. I don't watch too much television. I don't get most of my news from television anyway. But I still believe that in Africa, we have a need for a digital platform of some sort that showcases the African narrative. It used to be 20, 30 years ago, long before satellite television and before breaking news on CNN became the norm, that we all gravitated towards what the West was telling us, or what CNN was telling us. Well, in the last few years, CNN, regardless of what our political views might be, I think actually insults my intelligence. When I tune into Fox or when I tune into CNN, all I'm hearing about is Donald Trump. And I'm saying to myself, in a world of billions of people, where there's so many issues and so many activities going on, why in the world should I listen to issues about a particular president ad nauseum? We can create a digital platform. We can create a broadcast platform for Africa if the resources are there. But at the end of the day, what it will require are narratives that are engaging, content that is entertaining. I think many times we forget that entertainment is the biggest draw for communication platforms. People go to be
in which case those networks are there. MTV Base is there, Trace is there. There's a lot of those things.
Yeah, so what we need to do, and I'm glad you used the word platform, create a platform where we can bring on creative, entertaining content. And I think if we're able to do that, we will find good success.
Sorry, guys, I'm back.
Oh, welcome back, Sophie.
Welcome back, Sophie.
I had a challenge with my earphones. That's what's called.
Back.
Bluetooth, digital technology, and it got the best of us. We don't have much time left, so just to wrap up,
Sophie,
I'm going to ask each of you just to give a final thought before we wrap up today's session. Perhaps we go backwards. I'll start with you this time, Moky.
Yeah, thanks. You know, the one thing I'll say, and I'm thinking about the audience listening in, and you know, if it's a group of communicators, people who are in the same business that me, Victor, and Otega are in, I think what we need to start thinking about is really, how do we up our game? How do we deliver on this strategic communications that's needed? You know, I think a lot of us have been challenged by the speed of this communication, the platforms we need to adapt to. There's a lot of things that we as communicators have had to deal with during this crisis. And I think now it's time for us to go and sharpen those skills, because the next crisis is coming, because it will come. And there needs to be a group of communicators who are ready to step in, not who are learning on the job, but who are ready to step in. So that's what I would say, that let's figure out how we up our skills, and let's go and do that.
And Otega, bring you in.
Yes, like I wanted to say earlier, we need to look at it from 2 points of view. We need, like Moky said, we need individuals that will stand up. We also need, which is a conversation we're having earlier on, we also need to look at platforms that will push our messaging out there. So it's not really a Victor side or Moky side. It's more of what can we do as communicators, as governments, and even the private sector, what can we do to get together in helping to scale these little platforms that we already have? Because if you look at Africa as a whole, communications, public health messaging, and all of those are very, very local. You understand? I'll rather listen to my local news, like Moky said, but there's nothing stopping us as a continent from having a platform that pushes that messaging on the mass scale, which is what we need. And also, finally, very, very important that those of us who are communicators do a lot in developing ourselves. We need to go back to the basics. The interesting thing about communications and marketing is the more things change, the more the basics remain the same. It means that you need to really, really understand the audience. Now, your audience does not necessarily mean those people you're communicating with, but your audience also means your internal executives, for instance, either your president or your leader or your CEO or whatsoever. They also form a very critical part of the audience. If you do not understand those basics of communications, fine-tuning your audience, segmenting them properly, pushing the right messaging through the right platforms and all those, there is absolutely nothing you want to do that will change things from where they are today. So we need to be more involved. We need to be more assertive in pushing our
Thank you. And Dr. Victor, can I get your final words?
Well, thanks, Sophie. I just want to pivot on what Otega and Moky have said. Indeed, new technologies, innovations, and platforms are changing the whole communication ecosystem. And that just means a whole lot more opportunities for us. We have a responsibility as leaders and as communicators to help our institutions, to help our principals see through the fog of the chaos of crisis, as it is in some instances, and the confusion, as well as the plethora of messages out there competing for the share of mind. As I said earlier, hope is not a strategy. Therefore, we have to be a lot smarter about how we do communication today. And I'll just throw in 4 things for us. Number one, we need to really move with a whole lot more speed than we have in the past. We need to be very, very comfortable with change and embrace it. We need to understand consumer shifts, changing consumer habits, and that's changing at hyper speed even as we speak. And we need to be able to connect the dots between what's happening in terms of local and global trends in order to be relevant. I'm just going to throw this out here from a business perspective, and again, reinforce what I said earlier about the need to communicate a whole lot more smarter in terms of the tremendous changes that we're some research just a short while ago and noticed that Amazon, for example, pre-COVID was processing about 19,000 orders per minute. Post-COVID today, it's 30,000 orders per minute. That is 1.8 million orders in an hour and 43,200,000 orders in a day. What does that mean for those who are in the retail business? What's true of Amazon globally is going to be true of other domains, whether you're selling cars, whatever it is that you're doing. The whole business model has changed. Every industry today is a new startup. What worked yesterday will not work today. And therefore, we need to up our game in terms of how we understand our consumers, how we understand audiences, and how we communicate effectively with them.
Well, for me, I just want to say thank you so much to my panelists today. What a great way to kick off Africa Communications Week. We'll be having sessions from today until the 29th. I think this was a great tone setter. So to the Pathfinders, I hope you've been able to get a few nuggets to take you forward. So thank you so much, Moky. Thank you so much, Dr. Victor. Thanks so much, Ote. Have a blessed Africa Day.
Sophie, thank you very much. Same to you, and it's been a wonderful pleasure.
Absolutely. Thank you all.